Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Octopus Builds, where we are building out the Trident project for the fictional company Octopet Shop. My name is Bob Walker, and I am the Technical Director of Customer Success here at Octopus Deploy, and I want to talk to you a little bit about Runbooks today. So, what has happened since our last recording? Well, the dev team has been hard at work, and they've started noticing a few things. The first thing they noticed is we don't have a database yet, and we haven't built out a database for their application. Everything has been pseudocode, even though we're on version 1.2 of this fictional application. So we want to get that database out there. And for the next few episodes, that's what our primary focus is going to be, is getting that database deployed using Octopus Deploy. Now, the first thing we need to do is we want to make sure that the database exists to begin with, so we have something that we can deploy to and that it is properly configured. Now, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be leveraging the Runbook functionality within Octopus Deploy. So let's dive right in. So let's jump over to Operations, and this is something new that we haven't discussed before on this particular series, which is Runbooks. So Runbooks and deployments look and talk and walk an awful lot alike, but the primary difference between Runbooks is that they are, as it says right there on the screen, designed to automate routine or emergency related processes. For instance, disaster recovery or database backups, or in our case, spinning up some new infrastructure to make sure it's still there. So let's talk through what we want to do for this particular one. What we want to do is let's go ahead and let's say, let's call this create database. Not really, create Trident database. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating a runbook that will ensure that the database is created and it's there, and it's properly configured so we can then deploy to it in the future. And the reason behind this is because what you'll see typically with a lot of new projects is that creating the database might be done by, say, a developer in a dev SQL Server, or even a DBA in a dev SQL Server. But then there's kind of this weird sort of period of time between maybe when it goes from dev to test, or maybe that goes pretty quickly, so you create the database and test as well. So you have the database in both dev and test, but then once it kind of goes through that whole QA cycle, and that QA cycle and build cycle, that could take several weeks. Then it's like, okay, let's push up to staging, and then you forget that the database hasn't been created in staging and production yet. And maybe to create something in production, you have to get a whole production change request and all that other good stuff. So what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be creating the Trident database, and I'm just add a simple runbook. If it doesn't exist. Nothing super complex. So go ahead and save this. Now, we have a number of steps in our community library which we're going to be leveraging, but for the purposes of this series and to make things fairly simple, is I'm using a cloud instance, and just to again demonstrate all this functionality, this isn't something you'd probably do on a production level instance as in at all. What we want to do is we want to come in here and we want to actually install SQL Server Local DB. So, because that is what's, oops, not Server, SQL Server Local DB. So SQL Server Local DB is or Local LB, is a small, oh my God, Local DB, geez. So what is SQL Server Local DB? SQL Server Local DB is a small runtime that's used for development tasks such as what we're about to do. As a way, it's kind of a light rate version of SQL Server. It doesn't have a number of different features and functionality, but for our purposes, it has everything we need. We just need something to house our tables and just run some very simple SQL scripts against. Nothing super complex. We want to run it on a worker. It's going to be hosted Windows. I'm going to run directly on the worker. And all we're going to do is, let me just copy in my script so you don't have to sit there and wait for me to type this all out, is I'm just going to do chocolatey install SQL Local DB. So all of the dynamic workers that we have has Chocolatey pre-installed on it. So if you need to add any additional software for your dynamic worker, you can do that using Chocolatey. Or if you are using our hosted Ubuntu, you can use the apt-get package manager. So Chocolatey is a package manager that allows you to add software in a headless state, so you don't have to remote into the server or do anything like that. So I'm just going to do SQL Server Local DB. Happy days. The next thing I'm going to do is I want to come in here and I want to add in my community step library, community step template that I wrote a long time ago. So let's come over to SQL Server. And this is one of my very first steps I wrote when I started working at Octopus Deploy. SQL Server, SQL create database if not exists. But the key thing is I'm not going to be using SMO. Because I'm not installing the full-on SQL Server, I'm just installing a small, lightweight version of SQL Server. It's not going to have SMO or SQL management objects. So I'm going to go ahead and install and add. And let's just create the database if not exists. Let's rerun it on the same worker. Run directly on the worker. So what's the SQL Server going to be? So for purposes of this purposes of building out this, what it's going to be is this local DB MS SQL DB. That's what it's going to be. We're going to be using integrated security for our login, so I don't have to worry about usernames or passwords. And the database to create, I'm going to cheat, at least for the purposes of this initial runbook run, and just use Trident underscore database name. Environment name. Environment name. All right, and I don't have to do anything else. So what this step is going to do is it's going to create the database after we install the SQL Server Local DB, nice and easy on something like that. And then let's also configure Slack. I want to run this on a worker as well. Hosted Windows is fine. The hook URL, because one of the advantages of Runbooks is it has access to the same variables that the project does or your deployment process does. So I can come in here and I can just grab the same notification webhook URL that I had previously. Same thing with the channel handle. I think I called it, I can't remember what I called it. It's been a little while since I last recorded it. So I'm just going to call this Trident notifications if I recall. Notifications. I should probably make that a variable. Username Octopus Deploy. Title is going to be my subject. My message is going to be my notification body text. And I want this to be red because I'm only going to have this run on failure. That way I know if something bad happens, I can pop this off pretty quickly. Alrighty. So let's just say notify when install fails. Or I say that when database creation fails. Now, for other runbooks, or if I was fully fleshing out this entire runbook process, I probably would also look to add, make sure that the database has a role associated with it, and then has an appropriate user associated with it. I'm not going to do all that just because hopefully you get the point with just these few steps. What the nice thing is again, you get the same editing process as you do with a deployment process. All right. Let's go ahead and run this. Now, one of the really interesting things about Runbooks is, again, depending on your permissions, but unlike your deployment process where I have to deploy to dev first and then deploy to QA or deploy to staging first and deploy to production, I can run a runbook on any environment. And that's one of the powers of Runbooks. And that's what it's designed to do, is it allows you to go ahead and run something on any environment that's out there. So once a runbook process has been defined, you can run it. Now, I haven't published it yet, and I'll get into publishing in just a little bit. But one of the really nice things about this is now I can just test out running this runbook, make sure that it can run on dev. It shouldn't take too long to I don't know. I haven't. I let my worker expire. I was building this earlier, and just making sure everything works. And apparently I had waited too long between making sure everything works and when I actually started recording, so we're going to have to sit here for a little bit and wait for this to run. But while it's running, I can talk a little bit about publishing. So publishing a runbook, and I'm fairly certain this is going to work, so I'm just going to go ahead and publish this. So what publishing a runbook does is, it says what it right in that help text, it makes it available to consumers and triggers. So if I was logged in as, say, a developer or a QA person who only had permissions to run a runbook in a certain environment or anything along those lines, I have to publish it so they can access it for the very first time. Until I do that, this runbook is not available to anyone else unless they have the appropriate editing permissions. We have two roles in our database, excuse me, in Octopus Deploy called Runbook Consumer. So this is someone who can view and execute runbooks, and then we have Runbook Producer, which is someone who can edit and execute runbooks. So again, while we're waiting for this to run, why don't we also go ahead and configure our teams appropriately, because we want to make sure that everything aligns with what we're trying to do. So for developers, right now he has the ability to create a release, do a deployment to dev and QA, as well as project contributor. Now, one of the interesting things about runbooks is you might see a scenario where the runbook's editing permission is limited to a certain number of people. If we were to come in here to, say, project contributor, probably would not see runbook edit in there. Oh, it is in there. Okay, well, shows what I know. So if you have project creator, a project contributor, you have the ability to edit runbooks for that particular project as well. So let's make sure we have all the permissions set for each team. So the DBAs, they have project contributor as well, so they can also edit runbooks, which makes sense because they have the ability to edit the deployment process. Now, a QA person, they should only have permissions to, create a deployment and view. So deployment creator, all they can do is runbook run create and runbook run view. This is perfect. And we can also make sure then they'll only have the ability to do this when they only have the ability to run runbooks in QA and staging as well. So this is one of those nice things where it's kind of all built in terms of permissions. So let's just verify our final permission in terms of web admins, which they should have permissions to run a runbook anywhere, which is going to be deployment creator, view selected only, run create, and they don't have any scoping, and then release creator, they have, just release create. Awesome. So in this particular scenario, developers have the capability to go ahead and run a runbook and create the runbook, and same thing with the DBA. They have the ability to edit runbooks and create runbooks and do whatever they need, whereas QA and web admins, they cannot modify those runbooks whatsoever. Now, if we look at it from like a big picture production point of view, there might be specific projects that developers don't have permissions to. Maybe it's on a different space, maybe it's on a maybe it's just a completely different project and you have more fine-grained permissions, because you can come in here, and so far we've only scoped permissions to environments, but you can come in and you can scope permissions to specific project groups, to specific projects, and so on and so forth. So you might have a situation where you say the web admins, they have a series of runbooks that they have permissions to create, and only they have permissions to edit or do anything along those lines. But let's come back to the runbook, and again, I want to make sure that it's running and it ran correctly. So it ran successfully. So installed SQL, the local DB, and then it also created the database if it doesn't exist. Awesome. So we feel pretty confident about this. So again, we want to go ahead and publish this so the web admins and the QA folks, they have the ability to run this runbook. So available to consumers and triggers, a snapshot will be set as a published version of the runbook. So what that means is very similar to creating release. So what's going to happen is we're going to snapshot this deployment process, snapshot any variables, and that way if we run the runbook again, we'll have access to the same process and variables that we did when the snapshot was created. And that's something you'd want in a Runbook, especially if you're giving it to, say, a QA person or web admin who's not really familiar with how these Runbooks run for this particular project. And it's like you understand what is needed to get this system back up and running. So we're going to trust you to kind of handle all of that for it. So that is running a Runbook. All right. So we have made sure that it has run in development, which is great. However, what we'd like to do is have the ability to go in, and we want to do that. We want to verify the database exists when we're doing a deployment, because that's really ideal, because that's when it's going to be the most important thing, especially when we start adding in the database deployment step in a later episode. So let's go ahead and let's set ourselves up for success right now. Now, before I do this, as I clicked into this step, I realized I'm going to need an API key for this step to work. So, and what I mean by that is, so I can just come in here and I can filter Runbook. So there is a run an Octopus deploy Runbook that I also wrote. And what we're going to want to do is run the Trident database creation Runbook. Again, we want to run this on a worker. We don't want to run it on a deployment target, and that's because we want to make sure that we only need to run this once, and we need to run it on that particular pool anyway. So the Runbook name, and again, because I'm an idiot, I already forgot the name of the Runbook. So let's open up a new tab. Create Trident database. It's not having a good day, I guess. So create Trident database. And then then it does provide a number of built-in things automatically for you, which is great. So it says, hey, we're going to automatically go to your server URI, which is exactly what I want, but I will need to provide an API key. So let me go ahead and do that. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to right-click, go to open a new tab, and I'm going to go to my profile. So an API key allows you to access the Octopus Deploy API. In a production scenario, we'd want to create a service account. And why don't we just do that right now? So I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to create a service account for this. So let's come into users, and I'm going to create a service account. And I'm going to call him the create database service account, and I'll just copy the same thing over here. Now, the difference between a service account and a user is that a service account can only be used to access the API. It cannot be used to log into the UI like what we're seeing right now. But the advantage of this is now we can have a shared API key that we can then pass out. We can also limit the permissions as to what this user can and can't do. So I'll show you exactly what I mean. But first, I need to create a new API key, and that's to Octopus builds. Let's call it that. I think that's a good idea. And I'm going to go ahead and copy this to the clipboard, paste it over into my notepad you can't see on my screen. And all right, so we have that API key. The next thing we want to do is let's go ahead and let's create a team, add this team, and I'm going to call this my Runbook service account team. Yeah. And accessible in this space only. Perfect. And I want to add a member, and I'm going to go ahead and create database service account. A little on the nose with the name I determined. And let's go ahead and let's include a user role. And what I wanted for this user role is they can only be a Runbook consumer. They can't edit the Runbook. They can't do anything else besides this. So they can create Runbook runs. They can view a whole bunch of things, but that's really it. They're completely limited as to what you can and can't do. And this is something that I would recommend for anyone who's creating a service account, is to limit the permissions as to what it can and can't do. So let's go ahead and click on save. Awesome. So now it has the appropriate permissions. Now let's come back to my screen, and I am going to, for the time being, copy this in as is. Awesome. Give it the space name. You give it the project name. because you can have runbooks with the same name in multiple projects, and this just helps the step template figure out what's going on. Environment name, tenant name, we're not deploying to tenants. Use publish snapshot, yes. Wait for finish, yes. We do not want to use guided failure, so we can leave pretty much everything else as is. As you can imagine, this thing has quite a number of different options that are out there. We can also do something where, like, hey, we're only going to run this for dev and test. So maybe we only run this in our default channel when we're doing our development work, because we know that it's going to be out there on staging and production, and that's completely within reason. But for the purposes, again, for this particular example, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to reorder the steps because I want this to appear at the very beginning. And let's go ahead and commit. And I'm going to say adding in a runbook step. And we want to create a new branch. Just call it Runbook. Because if you remember from our previous episode, we have created a I need to make that a variable. Okay then. That is not a problem. What I will do is I'm going to just copy this over. I'm going to make it a variable over here. And I'm just going to say project.runbook.api.key. Change the type to sensitive. And awesome. So just copy this in, copy this. That's interesting. I completely forgot that you can't do something like that. But it makes a lot of sense, because if I were to save that to source control as a sensitive value, it would be saved as plain text in OCL, which would not be a good thing. I'm glad we have that in there. So let's go ahead and commit again, and let's go ahead and commit this. Okay. So let's refresh the branch list. Runbook. Oh man, I found a nice little fun bug. That's all right. Not a big deal. It is fairly simple to go ahead and add this back in. Run once on a worker, so you get to see me do it again. Create Trident database. We can go back and make the API key. Runbook API key. And Trident, even though that's not really required. And everything else really the same. Sweet. Commit. I just realized I didn't reorder, so let's go ahead and reorder the steps. And we want to commit again. Awesome. All right. So we have added in the Runbook step, so we can now call it from a deployment process, because that's something we want to do. It'll be the default channel, one package, and let's go ahead and rock and roll. Let's deploy this to development. So assuming I wired up everything correctly, what we're going to see is that as part of the deployment, what it's going to do is going to kick off the Runbook for us. And it's going to say, yep, it obtained the lease successfully. And this step is pretty verbose in terms of what it logs. So if you're ever curious as to what it's doing, you can come into this log and you can actually see what's going on. In addition, I also made it super easy, so you can go ahead and click here, and it'll load up the Runbook, and we can see what's going on, what's the Runbook status going, and how's that coming along. So this should be pretty quick most of the time, especially if you're going to be rerunning this fairly quickly, run right after another, and if you're following along, it's going to go again fairly quick, no more than a few seconds. And there we go. So if we come back here, we should see it come back and say, yep, I'm waiting. I've got the latest update, finished with a task success, and now this deployment process is going to proceed as is. In the next episode, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding in the step to actually deploy the database. So I've created a package that we can use that will let us do that. But the first thing we needed to do is just get the Runbook out there. Awesome. Well, that is it for this episode. I hope you found it useful and got to see a use case of Runbooks and how to run a Runbook from a deployment process. Thank you very much for watching, and have a great rest of your day.